quick overview of what's going on, setting the scene in Japan. Number one, with all these problems that supposedly Japan has had over the last 20, 30 years, you actually see that in terms of the socio-economic system, that the outcome that Japan produces is fantastic. Because when you look at a variety of social problems, you actually see that Japan is exactly where you want to be. It is the best socio-economic system in the world. Of course, once I showed this chart to the previous Trump White House, they looked at this and said, yes, go America, top right-hand corner. But you get the point why we love Japan. It's not just Anzen Anshin, but despite massive asset deflation, corporate governance reform, the actual outcome in terms of holistic society is very good. There's often the criticism that Japan doesn't change. Well, actually, Japan has changed more than all of the other industrialized economies. Let's look who actually owns Japan. And you see that Japan used to be dominated by mochiai, by cross-shareholdings, with about 50% of the equity tied up in cross-shareholdings, with the banks owning almost 30% of the entire corporate sector. That has been changing quite dramatically. The bank's stakes, for all intents and purposes, has gone down to close to nil. And you do see that global investors have gone from owning barely 5% of the market to about 1/3 of the market. And of course, we do have also our friends from the public pension system and the Bank of Japan having socialized some of the equity, now owning slightly more than 15% here. So there has been change. In simple terms, Japan has moved from a system of insider capitalism towards one of outsider capitalism, where the outsiders are the primary principals rather than the insiders. Now you see that the changes in corporate governance, the changes in capital stewardship, and the changes in ownerships have started to actually feed a tremendous pickup in attack on corporate management. It is quite remarkable. This year, we're actually running at a clip that almost 250 companies are likely to get a majority bid for their operations. Now, remember, there's about 4,000 companies here in this country. So it's quite incredible, to see that last year, almost 5% of companies, got a takeover bid. Now this is accelerating even further. Why are particularly foreign investors, but also global investors doing this? Is because, yes, thank you, Japan is unbelievably rich. This country has the laziest balance sheets of anybody in the world. If you look at the ratio of cash or of retained earnings, it is absolutely spectacular how rich and how lazy corporate Japan is. Still, about 1/3 of all listed companies have more cash on their balance sheet than the equity is worth. Now, that also leads to fun, which is why we love Japan, right? You not just have lazy balance sheets, you also have some wonderful quirks in terms of excessive innovation. I mean, this is a country where last year, 1,300 new non-alcoholic beverages were launched. Robbie's personal favorite was sparkling mayonnaise, which was a big hit, and one of the reasons why 7-Eleven had to be attacked by an activist there. But you get the point. Now, having said this, when you actually do look at the efficiency and effectiveness of the salaryman executive in Japan, and you look at the data for listed companies, you actually see that the salaryman CEO, the executive here, actually does deserve the Nobel Prize for Applied Economics. For the last 30 years, we had effectively zero top-line growth, but profits rose by 11 times, which is quite an incredible achievement. So there is an enormous amount of good despite all this activist and private equity activity. There's actually an enormous amount of good and efficiency that's coming through. And I leave this for you to discuss. Despite having spectacular executive performance, you know, the compensation structure, well, in Japan, in the US, it's easy to pick on. The average CEO now earns 400 times what the average employee of that company earns. While in Japan, that has gone up. It's now about 32 times, right? Up from about 12 times. But I leave it up to you. In my opinion, the governance of greed, Japan is actually a role model going forward. Now, the story of my life, I've been here for 40 years, is that you do see EPS, so earnings per share, so the corporate performance actually has improved very, very dramatically, but the price earnings multiple, so what does the market pay for, you see that corporate Japan actually gets no credit. Now, to look at some of the dynamics that executives, that corporate boards are under, let's pass it on to Andrew to give us some insights. Andrew has, in his career in Japan since 1998, he's done about 60 or so shareholder proposals and board restructurings. So he does actually know what he's talking about. Andrew, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jesper. By many of you who are here in the room and also online. And I want to thank all the panelists for, first of all, reading my long emails and just participating in what has been a wonderful dialogue and one that I hope continues beyond today. Yesterday, I lost my wallet somewhere on the train or in the taxi. I'm not sure where. It will surprise none of you who spent a lot of time in Japan to hear that within 3 hours, some kind Japanese person had turned it in to the Tokyo station Koban, where I picked it up. It will surprise no one who knows me that this is unfortunately not the first time, but it's actually the third time since I first came to Japan 30 years ago that I've lost my wallet. And each time someone has rescued me. And I thought, what a wonderful metaphor for what we're trying to do today. The American with a lost wallet who is saved by the Japanese, who understands that financial markets rely, as the Wall Street Journal wrote once, on virtues that it cannot supply, that these financial markets are here to serve our society, not to be served by it. And so that's really what's motivating me. It's not just what we can do here about Japan, but it's really what Japan can teach the U.S. Quick show of hands, how many people are involved in the finance industry? Okay, well, I want to apologize to all of you, but also confess I'm part of that. And a lot of the things I'm going to say are provocative. They may be unpleasant, but I guess if they are sins, I am the principal sinner. I've done all of these things myself, and probably worse than anyone here. So please don't take it personally. I'm going to very quickly give a couple of comments or quotes that I think we'll come back to. The first is a short quote from a poem, because Robbie, you were so kind to come to Memphis or Nashville and do the same. But take it, if the smack is sour, the better for the embittered hour. It should do good to heart and head when your soul is in my soul's stead. And I will friend you, if I may, in the dark and cloudy day. The second is from Nobel Prize winning economist James Tobin, inventor of the Tobin cube. He said this in 1989 when the United States was at basically the same place in the evolution of private equity that Japan is today. He said, we're throwing more and more of our resources, including the cream of our youth, into financial activities remote from the production of goods and services, into activities that generate high private rewards disproportionate to their social productivity. And finally, the star of the show is Nitobe, and I'm just going to read something quickly and we'll come back to it. Every thinking bushi, which is another word for samurai, knew well enough that money formed the sinews of war, but he did not think of raising the appreciation of money to a virtue. Japan faces a choice today, and Jesper's slides really highlighted those two choices. We're really here because a few months ago, Alicia made the prediction that in 5 years, KKR will own 40% of the Japanese stock market. Small companies. Well, I'm rolling. Don't let the facts get in the way of a good story. So that's door number one. Now, door number two is, will Japan apply Kaizen, continuous improvement, to a public market model that is good enough for Warren Buffett, the GPIF, and yours truly? Now, those of us on this stage cannot make that choice. We can lay out the evidence of what's happened in Japan and abroad in the past. We can explain why we think that Japan already has a capitalism that works. But ultimately, it's Japan's citizens who need to tell Japan's story better or have it written by someone else. Now, fortunately, Japan has a model for how to do this. And I want to thank my first boss, Mr. Fukushima, who's here today, for giving me this book by Nitobe, Bushido, The Soul of Japan. Now, as many of you know, Nitobe wrote at a time similar to our own when the balance of power in Asia was shifting. Now, he wrote to describe Japanese ethics to a West, and he wrote in impeccable English, and he drew on examples from both sides to show that virtues and vices were very similar across countries once you did the homework. He was so successful that President Theodore Roosevelt distributed the book to his entire White House staff, made them all take judo lessons, and wrote this to Congress: "The Japanese have won on their own merits and by their own exertions the right to treatment on the basis of full and frank equality. We have as much to learn from Japan as Japan has to learn from us, and no nation is fit to teach unless it is also willing to learn." Now, interestingly, this approach to Japan, almost exactly these words, describe Warren Buffett's approach so far. They describe how I feel when I'm told again and again that Japanese companies only do things if pressured from gaisatsu. It's not my experience, and I think we can learn a lot from getting past that narrative. Now, as for our president, I don't think we can expect Mr. Trump to start taking judo lessons on the White House lawn. But I do think that a new Nitobe could help America and the rest of the Indo-Pacific understand the benefits of Japan's public market model. And this new Nitobe, just like the old, would base his argument on specific examples from both sides. And I think he'd break his case into 4 points. Number one, Japanese public companies are underrated. Number two, private equity, particularly in Japan so far, is overrated and overexposed to the PRC. Number three, the players and their incentives matter. And number four, most hopefully and most importantly, we can learn from each other. I'm going to spend 1 minute on each of these points so we can get to the panel. They all tie into the same idea. The Japanese public market system, while not perfect, is the best in the world right now because it's putting the best players on the field at the lowest cost, as your slide showed earlier. Imagine the Dodgers with the lowest instead of the highest payroll in the MLB, and you'll get the idea. Now, the first point, Japanese public companies are underrated. Just look at the stats from my friend John Thorndike, from Ulrike Schade, and from Jesper. All of them show that real operating performance, as distinct from relative stock market performance, has been world-beating for several years. And this performance has not come at the expense of financial resilience, community engagement, returns to shareholders, or technical competence, particularly in fields that really matter right now. Japan's a quality leader from ships to chips to AI-enabled manufacturing to nuclear engineering and to animated content. The fact that the stock market investors have not recognized this performance is not management's fault, and this is where I disagree with Mr. Yamaji and the tactics he's used. It's not the fault of management. It is the fault of the backwards-looking, complexity-loving, narrative-driven investment management industry of which I am a card-carrying member. And And this is the worst part. I don't want any of my clients to see this slide, but the reality is that even the so-called underperformance narrative is incomplete. Compare the real outperformance, which Robbie and Jesper will explain to anyone who doesn't understand why that is important, not the nominal performance. Compare the GPIF to CalPERS or any other alt-heavy pension plan that has higher fees. I'm going to let you get to this, Yohei, if we can. There we go. Okay, there. I don't know if you can see that, but that's a GPIF versus CalPERS. And you'll see that despite paying higher fees and hiring thousands of extra people and creating enormous complexity, the GPIF has massively outperformed CalPERS over the last 20 years. If the CalPERS model with 34% alts and all the complexity that goes with it were to be applied by the GPIF, which currently has less than 2% in alts, the GPIF would need to hire 9,000 additional people. It currently has 200. And pay an additional $8 billion in fees compared to the $250 million it pays right now, all in. You can understand why Nomura wants that to happen and why KKR wants that to happen. But for those of us who are citizens, who require those funds to be part of what Jesper beautifully calls intergenerational equity, this is a very important number to understand, particularly when you realize that in spite of all this complexity, the GPIF has said, at CalPERS, the GPIF has done better. And the same thing happens if you look at OMERS, which is the Canadian version, or really any of these plans. And this is what attracted Warren Buffett, not the so-called narrative about corporate changes and so on, but the actual performance of Japanese companies and the quality of their management and the relevance of their products. And that really is most important as we look ahead, and really the thing that concerns me most. Because look at the companies today. Who would you rather have? Who's more prepared for the world we're facing? Sony, Hitachi, IHI, KHI, MHI, Okuma, Nintendo, or Intel, GE, Boeing, Disney, RTX, LMT, HHI, and the whole constellation of over-levered and undermanaged private equity companies? Who would you choose? I think it's obvious. This past week has shown how important what Japan has to offer. America is the supplicant, not the other way around. And I'm sorry for those tickers, but they are a reminder of something we should have said at the beginning. None of this is investment advice from any of us. We're telling stories, not selling stocks. Second point, private equity is overrated and overexposed to the PRC. The new Nitobe would contrast Tungaloy, which was Mr. Buffett's first investment in Japan and one that's been wildly successful and is still managed by the Japanese management team that was in place when he bought it in 2010. And Denso, which we'll talk about more later, those are both still public companies. He'd compare those with the twice bankrupt Calsonic, which was supposed to be the archetype of the KKR or the private equity deal, and the recently bankrupt First Brands. All four of those companies in the same broad market. Denso, Tungaloy are thriving, the other two are dead. He'd compare Toshiba Memory, now called Kyaxa for reasons I can't understand, with Sony and Hitachi. And in the healthcare world, he'd look at PHC, another supposedly iconic transaction for private equity, with Fujifilm or BML, both public companies that are thriving in the same industry, even as PHC struggles. And finally, he'd urge you all to study the materials that I've handed out and understand the history of Hudai Bergmaster. This is the example that KKR's Henry Kravis gave to the Nikkei in a 30-day interview last year as an example of what KKR offers Japan. In the same interview, he talked about why KKR has modeled itself on Jack Welch. His words, not mine. And I think we should pay very close attention to them. Because Hudai was a deal, it was a great deal for KKR. It was the seminal transaction. It's what got Steve Schwartzman to do private equity, and they made a ton of money on it. But in the process, they bankrupted Bergmaster, the machine tool subsidiary of Hudai that had been critical to American industrial growth in the 50s and 60s. Before selling Hudai for scrap, KKR tried to get a Japanese public company called Okuma to bail him out. They refused. Today, Okuma still thrives as a public company on the bleeding edge of AI-enabled manufacturing, still faithful to its founder's commitment to advanced technology and good labor relations. And finally, he'd observed that the one place that private equity investments seem to have helped companies grow is the PRC. He'd note that just last month, Bain announced a successful $4 billion investment in China's AI data center market, and that the Shanghai branch of the Chinese Communist Party celebrated KKR's first ever RMB fundraising. This was 3 weeks before KKR entertained Kishida-san at the Akasaka Palace. Now, in a world in which Japanese public companies are being forced by America to choose between the PRC and the West, Nitobe-san would wonder why Japan doesn't ask the same thing of the private equity firms who are so eager to take over its leading companies. That one of KKR's most successful investments in China was Q. Q is a critical piece of the Chinese Communist Party's surveillance business. You can read about it in the congressional hearings on private U.S. companies funding Chinese infrastructure that supports the military. And that gets back to the third point, incentives. Charlie Munger, Warren Buffett's late and wonderful partner, famously said, "Show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome." The finance-first model, whether it's applied to private companies or public companies, incentivizes managers to raise money and do deals, not to make things. When you incentivize companies to make things, you get managers, surprisingly, who are good at making things. This is not a cultural difference. Japan had exactly the same problem that the U.S. has today in 1989 when its bankers were in charge of allocating cheap capital, and they did a terrible job. And what Japan is doing now is simply what America did in the 40s and 50s, interestingly, after it came out of a deflationary period, letting makers lead while putting finance where it belongs in a support role. This is less about public versus private markets and more about incentives. So in the U.S., the same company, people running the PE companies are running the worst performing public companies, even while they're paying themselves more and more each year. Look at the backgrounds of Greg Hayes at RTX, Doug Calhoun and Jim McInerney at Boeing, Bob Swan at Intel, and basically everyone at GE and at all of the private equity-run, over-levered, undermanaged companies. All of them are accountants, investment bankers, and consultants. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's what we've all been. But that doesn't qualify you to run a company that makes nuclear power plants. But that's not how the U.S. has operated, and that's not how private equity operates. On the other hand, look at the CEOs of IHI, MHI, Okuma, Nintendo, and almost every other Japanese company that got there by doing things. It's not hard to understand. It's a basic principle the Dodgers follow. And that brings me to my last point, which I'll accelerate through, but it's the most important one, and it's a hopeful one. We can do this. In fact, we are doing it, and not just on the baseball field. When you put Japanese engineering and Western engineering together, you get the best of both worlds. Robbie and I spent the last 2 days at the 47th Southeastern U.S. Conference. It was in the Nikkei yesterday. Governor Josh Klein of South of North Carolina described the billions of dollars of investments that are being made by Japanese companies in the Southeast and the community impact they've had. And that is not happening because of finance and private equity. It's happening because of Japanese engineering investments that have been made with a generational view. And that's what Palmer Luckey's doing at Anduril on the defense side. And more hopefully, and this is my last prop, it's what's happened in my home state of Tennessee, where an American engineering CEO decided to bring the manufacture of Sharpie pens back to the United States. And he did so with a $2 billion investment in Japanese automation equipment made by a Denso subsidiary. No jobs were lost. He invested in the retraining of all the employees. They're making 50% more, 50% higher salaries. And the reason they were able to do that is that Denso has made a generational commitment to Maryville, Tennessee. I've seen it with my own eyes. They built the high school that my colleague Yohei went to, that my wife Kelly went to. They supported the technical training institute that Newell used to train its people to run these machines. So this is, I think, the model that we can look at. We have two choices. We can let the 1% who have taken America and made it the richest country, but also the most equal country in the planet, a country that can no longer make the things that it needs. Or we can take from Japan the partnership with people who have been tested by time and actually learned how to make things without relying on financial engineering. How can we do that? How can we make it so that we can have this new model of a distributed equity ownership without losing the essence which makes these Japanese companies so competitive and so valuable in such valuable parts of the community? That is a question I think Nitobe would ask, and it's a question I'll ask the panel.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. What is remarkable is that you actually did get through in time, which is very, very good. I mean, there's a lot in here. I think it's very, very important to actually look, despite all the glib and all this excitement about AI, about private equity, the Nikkei above 50,000, it is very, very important, to focus, on what are capital markets all about. Now, for a reaction here, Robbie, you've got the sexiest bow tie. We, in the spirit of Halloween, yes. Your quick reaction to Andrew's points.
Okay, thanks very much. I think I've got 2 or 3 minutes. Is that correct?
Yep.
This is a Halloween bow tie. It has nothing to do with zombies or companies that have become zombies. It's just Halloween. The question that we're really facing is, how do we design governance to improve productivity? It's important for every economy, but it's also much more important for Japan. Japan will lose 1% of the working population every year for the next 25 years. Unless we raise productivity by, call it 2% per year, Japan's position in the world will collapse. Okay? So the purpose of improving governance is to help raise productivity. Okay, fine. Over what horizon? It's got to be a longer-term horizon because the problem is a longer-term issue. When we think about this in terms of the PE model, I think about several things from the economics point of view. One is, how do you distribute the gains? Do they go to labor? Do they go to capital? Do they go to the intermediary who is funding the transaction? Okay? How do you treat labor? Productivity improvement necessarily involves capital investment, which in many cases replaces labor. Do you retrain the labor? You have to do that. But some has to find a new job. How do you compensate them to get them to agree to this? Okay? In particular, in a transaction by private equity or anyone else, do you give the people who lose their jobs stock in the company as it moves forward? I think that would create a lot of incentive for people to say, yeah, okay, I'm not going to be doing my job anymore, but I got a nice payout. I will take that payout, find something else. When I taught at Tokyo University of Science, there were several people in our class who had been replaced. They'd been, fired from their jobs, and they took their severance pay and invested it in the tuition to go to this program. So that's, another thing. So severance rules. Okay, so that's the economics of it very briefly. When I look at a financial institution, I try to look at a couple things. One is the structure of the balance sheet, how much cash, how much real assets on the asset side, and then how much debt, how much equity on the other side. And there are different ratios. A bank is different from an investment fund because of those differences. There's another section of the analysis. What does the P&L look like? Okay, how much is interest income? How much is dividends? And how much is fees? If the compensation structure is too heavily skewed toward fees, you'll get a very short-term horizon. And that's what you really have to avoid if you want a long-term approach to capital allocation. A third element, of course, is the management. And I have invented a new KPI, or key performance indicator. I call it the Jikko Hiritsu. That means the ratio of mouth to ear. When you're trying to evaluate management, you look at how much they talk and how much they listen.
I don't like that metric. Can I take the inverse of that, please?
Sure. Okay, very good. So one of the hardest things for the clients I talk to is how do you evaluate whether the management is really on board with that improvement in productivity? And I'm suggesting this Jiko Hiritsu as a way to do that. Next thing is the regulatory structure. One of the reasons that we've seen trouble in many financial models, be it the Japanese banks in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, or private equity today, is the issue of transparency. Do people really know what the incentives are? So the point about show me the incentives, I'll show the outcomes, Munger's point is very, very good. What about systemic disruption? So for example, if something doesn't work out and the company goes crazy or evaporates, how many people are they connected to and how much trouble is that going to have? That's exactly what we went through in 2008 because nobody knew who is connected to who. And so what we need to do is make sure that the authorities at least know who private equities and who others are connected to, and then we can know what will happen if a certain institution, say Silicon Valley Bank, goes bankrupt. So a tax, big deal. Dividend taxation, interest rate deductions are a very big deal in terms of the incentives of the financial institutions. So that's the regulatory part. Operations, do the people in charge know how to operate the company? Okay. I'm now on the board of Tokyo Marine, and I'll tell you, the people who are operating that company, they know insurance. This is really impressive. Okay. The last part I would say is, what is the business model? Is it balancing fees versus other kinds of earnings? And then, let's see, what's the other thing? Yeah. Basically, do they have a business model that encourages longer-term investment in new training for new workers? One of the most important things I think about AI today is that it requires an immense amount of worker retraining. Japan, I think, is doing a good job on this because basically there's such a labor shortage that the companies are training their workers because they know they can't find anybody. Okay? So, for example, Mitsubishi Corporation announced a few months ago that they would now require a third-party certificate in AI as a condition for promotion to management. I think that's very forward-looking. Okay? So, is the company training its workers for the next stage? That's another thing to look at. And finally, you mentioned Okuma as a great example. There's a sort of a backstory behind that that shows how forward-looking Okuma's management was, even back in the 1950s. There was a guy named Kumagai who joined them. He was responsible for setting up a lot of their American distribution. Okay, and he had actually gone to high school in America for a year under the exchange student program, AFS. So his English was excellent. He came back, they saw him, they said, oh, this is the guy we've got to send to start our American business. So they understood, the management of Okuma, even in the 1950s, they understood that cultural understanding was very important for their business. And so they hired the guy, he built their business, and he also built the AFS program in Nagoya. So that's what I benefited from when I went there a few years later. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make here is that the economics of the governance model are very, very important for achieving those long-term elements. And if I may also end with a little poem, the same one I used in Nashville. Robert Burns, would some power the gift to us to see ourselves as others see us? It would from many a blunder free us, full of notion. From airs and gait and dress relieve us, and also devotion. So what Japan can teach America is to be that mirror so that we can look at ourselves more accurately. And that's what I think all of us in the financial sector need to do, whether we're in PE or other parts of the industry.
Robbie, fantastic. Thank you. And George, you don't have to quote a poem, but your sort of reaction and a couple of thoughts. And George is very shy, but he does serve on the board of the biggest car company in the world.
Thanks, Jesper. I've got neither bow tie nor poem for you, but I do have Shima Kosaku, who is the slide there. I'm afraid you probably can't see it. But, I mean, my contribution today will be, from the perspective of of a board member of a Japanese listed company. I've been doing this for 18 years now, and I've served on the board of 8 listed Japanese companies. And although all companies are different, there's no one company that's the same as the other. Decisions are made very differently according to the company. Our positions in various global rankings of industries is different, etc. But Shima Kosaku is this is a series of manga produced. The guy who's been doing this for a long time, and he follows this guy called Shima Kosaku, who top left from his student days at Waseda University, focusing on his shukatsu, which is his employment-seeking activities, how he finds a job. And he finds a job at a company which resembles Panasonic. And each series goes through his life. First of all, so the second series on the top right, top left, the second from the left is Shukatsuhen, which is his a whole series devoted to how he finds a job. And then his young days, and then he becomes a manager, and then he becomes a general manager, and so on, until he actually, on the bottom right, that is his final post. He is a non-executive director. And Shima Kosaku is probably my age. I've just turned 70. And he started his life as a graduate, probably when I did in 1977. And this guy has gone through his entire life with one firm. And when I look back upon my university days, I went to university in the UK, and I have, been working for a lot of companies. I've had many careers, and so have most of my UK colleagues. But when you join a Japanese board, you know that every member of the executive has been with that company their entire life. And so Japanese companies are like communities, and decisions are made primarily for the community members. And I like your Jiko Hiritsu, but I think a lot of the Jiko Hiritsu, so your mouth and your ears, who your mouth speaks to and who you hear from, as a Japanese board is very different from the American. I think some of it is good and some of it is bad. And at a company like Toyota, the knowledge of the automotive industry of the combined executive is just unbelievably staggering. It's a fantastic company, and it's hard to think, even as an outsider, how anyone could be better at making cars than Toyota. And I was also a member of the board of Denso for 8 years, and I visited Tennessee, and I've seen how much we've done for the communities there. But how we work together with Denso and Aishi and all of our suppliers. I was at the Tokyo Motor Show yesterday, and we were talking about a certain new concept car that's coming out, and how it's a bus. It's sort of like an Alphard, and it's got 6 wheels, one in the front and 2 small ones in the back, and how difficult it is to have a 6-wheeled Alphard. And you've got 2 small wheels, which gives you more room. But the suspension problems that you get having 2 small wheels at the back are very, very complicated. But the ability of our engineers to work very closely with Denso for no reward for a very long time to solve this very gritty problem gives Toyota an incredible edge. Now, I have been a board member of 8 companies. 6 of those companies have had involvement with private equity and or activists. Toyota is going through its own issues right now with the delisting of one of our group companies. And I have to say that notwithstanding the negative influences of a lot of these people, and I do understand that in places like America it's lead to many negative outcomes. in Japan, there are still many companies who have too much cash and don't allocate proper capital properly. We have too many companies in so many industries. I mean, we don't need this many car companies. We don't need this many rolling stock companies. We don't need so many pen companies. And this Shima Kosaku salaryman strong company identity feature of Japanese companies, something that gets in the way of making Japanese companies competitive in the long term. So I'll stop there. But if you've got any more questions you want to, or discussion you want to have about this, I'm happy to answer.
I think I'm the outlier here. I think that Japan capitalism is severely failing its people, and I feel we don't do any favors by not showing some tough love to Japan, because we all love Japan. I am here to represent the Association of Committed Cynicism, because I came of age professionally as a bank analyst just as we were about to head into the financial crisis. And the inability of the regulators, of the government, of the executives running those financial institutions to ignore, to dissimulate, to refuse to face up to what was going on, and to come up with some solutions. To this day, I can't even begin to comprehend. Now, for the last 20 or 25 years, I've been working as a consultant on activist campaigns, and I encounter time and time again in dozens and dozens and dozens of boardrooms and CEO offices, the same sort of refusal to understand that the world is changing, that Japan is changing, that the global competition is changing, and that we need to react, not in 10 years, but right now. Japan has lost competitiveness in so many key industries that used to be the jewels of Japan. And so I disagree with everything Jesper said. And I really feel that this is a moment of truth. I may not think that people who are running PE firms or activist funds are necessarily the people that I would like to be married to or whatever, but I think that they are a necessary evil. And I think that PE, in particular in Japan, is a symptom of failure of corporate governance. The role of CEOs and the board of directors, particularly the executive directors, is to maximize human capital, is to maximize financial resources, and to maximize intellectual property. And I think there's only a very small handful of Japanese CEOs who understand that that is their mission, and there are even more few companies who have the necessary skills and experience within the boardroom to know how to do that. That's not necessarily their fault, right? Because, it was only until, it was many years after the corporate governance code was introduced that that such things became relevant. I mean, the corporate governance code was introduced by Abe in 2016, right? And it wasn't until the beginning of the dissolution of cross-shareholdings by the insurance companies, one of my ex-students, Mr. Miura, who forced the non-lifes to start to dissolve their cross-holdings, that any of this became relevant. Because, to own shares in Japan when we first started, they were held not as an investment, but as a business relationship, right? And so me as an equity analyst, I was breaking new ground. Nobody ever thought of security analysis. So I think the first thing I want to say is that activists who are the handmaidens of the PE firms, they're not acting only in their own best interest, right? Most of the campaigns that I work on are for God's sakes, please. You have fabulous business opportunities. You have a great product. Let us help you expand your business. It's like, no. Let me give you one example, and I'll be quick, which is there's one of the campaigns I worked on a year or so ago is sort of a housing construction element. And this product, the company has a 95% market share in Japan, 95%. Obviously, they have to go abroad. And I talked to many construction companies and architects in the US, in Europe. Everybody says, this is the best product, hands down, best product. We have a problem selling it to our customers because there's no English language website, and there's no showroom. So I go back to Shacho and I say, what about it? Here's what we, the activist firm, would like to help you with. And he says, well, We're Japanese. We rely on our reputation and on word of mouth to promote our product. And my reaction is, word of mouth in Japanese is not going to help sell your product in France, right? And so this is what I mean. It's not always that the actors with PE funds are the bad guys. My quote about, 50% of SMEs being owned by KKR in 5 years, I'm not saying that's a good thing. I'm saying I wish the CEOs of those companies would take control of their own destiny. And that's what the PE guys and the activist funds are trying to encourage them to do. And alas, we're not really having much luck. We're not making much progress. And I want to say also, I think somebody was talking about, cash on the balance sheet, maybe it was you. There's this, I think, assumption that these people, particularly activists, are carpetbaggers just after the dividend or whatever. I want to tell you that this year there were 332 shareholder proposals made in Japan, and only 35 of them were balance sheet related. The overwhelming majority were governance issues, like please put more independent directors on the board, please whatever, right? So this idea that, that people here are just, the vulture funds of old doesn't really hold up. The last thing I would like to just close with is to say, I find the government's attitude towards all of this activity completely psychotic, right? So you have, on the one hand, you have the National Economic Security guys at Métis, and you have Métis is the one who's, please consolidate. Here's JIC money, roll up everything. They just, not many people paid attention to this, but in June of this year, Métis just created an easier format for foreign PE funds to come here. So please consolidate. We love PE. FSA is like, well, what's going on here with activism? Now we have the new prime minister talking about creating a CFIUS. The case I want to call your attention to, we could talk about in Q&A if anybody's interested, I think that encapsulates all this, is the failed attempt by Minebea to be a white knight for Shibaura, a high-tech company that Métis permitted to be acquired by a Taiwanese company. And the guy who approved it at Métis told me that the very next day, he has like 6 Japanese companies in the same sector in his office going, we thought you were going to protect us, where's FEFTA, right? So what I want to say is I don't think even at the government there's a clear idea of what to do with all of this. But my main point is that I'm a fan of Japanese management. But it's time for the CEOs to start thinking about the future of their companies and not how long they're going to be CEO.
There's a famous story about people who are all in the room, and there's the elephant in the room, but it's dark, and one person can feel the trunk, and one person can feel the legs, and one person can feel the tail, and none of them are really sure exactly what the elephant in the room is. And one of the challenges that we face is that those of us in the financial industry know the financial industry, and I'm not going to dispute any of the things that Alicia said, but I want to contrast the experiences that the three of us have had, and we met, George and I met in an activist campaign almost 15 years ago in the insurance sector, where we own 20% of the company, and George went on the board as our representative together with a guy from Jamie Dalton's team, who Alicia knows well, Mr. Sano.
My boss.
So I've experienced this, and there were 13 insurance companies when we started out, and they didn't know insurance very well. They did a lot of things. They underwrote the entire asset-backed security sector unknowingly. They did a lot of crazy things. They've gotten a lot better, but it's taken a long time. I lost patience. It was a 20-year cycle. And I gave up just as George kind of saved the day. So in the moment, especially those of us who are judged on quarterly or annual performance, this can be very, very frustrating. But over the long term, and I think this is what Jesper's talking about, almost in spite of all of these crazy things that happen in the boardroom, there's still this enormous progress. Mitsubishi Heavy sends a rocket to the moon last week. We've got a new nuclear power plant that's going to be built up. I'm mystified where some of this comes from, given how crazy some of the things that happen in the boardroom are. But I will say this. In the U.S., you will have wonderful meetings with CEOs who can tell they have their best communicators, and then the door falls out of the airplane in flight. And that's what gets back to what George talked about, that we are so focused on this finance world and we feel like that's what matters. But what's the reason Japanese companies have done so well is not because of what's happened in the shareholder base. It's what's happened in the real world of competition. The reason Toyota is so good at making those cars is they're out there competing every day with Hyundai and everyone else. And I think that's what we have to collectively look at. We have to explain to these Japanese CEOs, hey, you need to do these things in order for you to continue doing that. I think where we disagree is that I have the burden of experience. I actually know a lot of the people personally who are involved in selecting the private equity board members and executives. I welcome them. I invited them in many cases. They failed the test, in my opinion. The people they put in charge, PHC is on its 5th CEO since KKR took over. We met yesterday with one of our investees who's a direct competitor. They have a ton of cash on their balance sheet, but it's run by a doctor and they know their business better than anybody in the country. The other competitor is currently under activist campaign. The person who is the activist has put on the board knows nothing about the industry. So I'm waiting. I want the best players on the team. I want the Dodgers to have, and if private equity has it, and then I'm willing to pay that extra 3% carry. But right now, they are charging us the Rolls-Royce price, and they're giving us a Pinto. And that doesn't work in a world where we're playing in a World Series that has much bigger stakes than what's happening on the baseball field. We're looking across the straits of Taiwan Straits at a PRC competitor who is getting tougher every day. And so I think we share the same objective, which is we've got to provide a capitalism that works and that brings the best of the U.S. and Japan together. I just don't think the activists and the private equity guys are bringing the best.
Right. Robbie, you were itching.
Couple things I wanted to mention. One is a wonderful book called The Culture Map. There's a Japanese translation called something Rikairyoku, Tabunka no Rikairyoku, I think it's titled. And one of the things that's very different about Japan from other countries is the degree of association of status and decision power. In most countries, the high status guy has the power to, or person or woman has the power to make decisions. Not true in Japan. And that's maybe one of the reasons the Japanese companies over the long run can make better decisions, because the guys at the top have to listen to the guys in the middle. So I'd encourage people to think about governance in terms of those cultural differences. The other thing I would point out is a little thing I've been using for 25 years now called the CRIC cycle, crisis response improvement complacency. And basically what it involves is 2 lines. If you do some reform, the economic improvements come a while later, but they come out. But when things get better, somehow the governance just gets lazy. And so what you got to do with governance is shift that relationship so that even when things are good, you still are looking at what the next, Godzilla will be to come and eat you. So what I consider important for governance is to improve the reaction of the board decisions to what's going on the ground. And that's why I'm so happy at Tokyo Marine that they take us around to different operating places. We just went yesterday to some of the IT guys, very impressive people. We've been to the claims group down in Osaka. You learn a lot. And I think board members need to do more of learning about what goes on at the base level so that they can bring that knowledge into the board and give management a hard time. I mean, my job at Oryx or now at Tokyo Marine is to give management a hard time in a way that has the knowledge and the logic that will say, yeah, we better do that now. Fortunately, we've been pretty lucky. Miyauchi used the board precisely in that way. If there's a problem, he would haul the guys in front of the board. Our job was to attack them, and his job was to say, but, they're right, so you better get on the stage. So I thought that was kabuki. So it's a very, very clever way of getting, call it, what's the right word, sarone, or grassroots information into the board. And that's one thing I think that external board members in particular need to do more of.
I'm going to jump in and give and remind us all of the problem is hard cases make bad law, right? If we're working with bad managers, it's easy to get frustrated. But the best example is Hitachi of what we're talking about here. And I've made a mistake in not recognizing Mr. Nakanishi. And the worst problem, the biggest issue that Japan has, I think all of us agree, is not telling the good stories. And so the bad stories get replicated. It's like you're training your LLM model on if you were training your LLM model on Japanese corporate history, you would get 1,000 stories on Toshiba and maybe 2 on Hitachi. And how many of the, if I say George Buckley's name here, does that mean anything to anyone? Raise your hand. I mean, one person. Everybody knows Henry Kravis. Well, George Buckley, he was the first outside director of Hitachi. And to your point, Nakanishi-san, the CEO of Hitachi, had a crisis. They had the largest loss in Japanese corporate history. They picked him to be CEO, and he got George Buckley, who was a nuclear physicist with 33 patents to his name and the ex-CEO of 3M, and who is a outspoken opponent of General Electric. And remember, this is 2009, 2010, when everyone's loving General Electric. And it was George who personally modeled the power plant plans that got Hitachi out of its problems in the UK and in South Africa. And he also had Cynthia Carroll, who was the CEO of Anglo American, a trained engineer. And she wasn't there because because she clicked some boxes. She was there because she knew her stuff, and she helped that company make decisions that all of us are benefiting from today. So I think that good example is something we just need to celebrate and tell more of.
George.
I do think, though, Andrew, that there is a very big problem in extrapolating how Hitachi does things to the rest of Japan. And everything I've heard about Tokyo Marine and how, Robbie's experiences at the company ring true. And that's why Tokyo Marine is such a great company. I don't know whether it's cause or effect, but, God knows Toyota's governance is not perfect. But one thing they really want me to do is to understand the company right to the bottom, understand why it's so competitive. But for every Toyota, I'm afraid to say, I've been a board member of 8 companies. There are also companies who absolutely are not interested in enabling me to get to know the company. I turn up for the board meetings and I have a briefing before. I'll have 30 meetings a year. I have 30 meetings a month at least at Toyota. Which is a bit too much, but I think Hitachi is a model which many Japanese companies should be able to implement. But language is a big issue. Hitachi's taken the step of having these non-Japanese on the board, but even there, it used to be that they had simultaneous interpretation. But it's a big barrier. Not to mention the time zone differences between the US or Europe and Japan, to globalizing the board. And there's a pathetic number of Gaijin's board members. There are 40,000 board members of listed Japanese companies, and maybe we have, when I first came to Japan this time, 2010, we had 257 foreigners.
Interrupt you.
This is my favorite story.
Yeah, one of my things, I don't know if you remember saying this to me 10 years ago or so. You said to me that now there was a record number of Gaijin NEDs on the board. The problem was that half of them were you. Quick response?
No, of course.
Because again, yes, we should obviously applaud the example of Hitachi. My question is, why isn't Panasonic taking that as an inspiration? And about the board, I give a lot of time talking about this. And one of my favorite examples to make this point, Oki Matsumoto is on the board of MasterCard. Japan is a very important market for Japan, right? I mean, Japan is a very important market for MasterCard. And Oki can be on the board, in spite of him being the CEO or chairman of Monex, because they have 4 board meetings a year that last 3 days, and they go into very substantial topics, whereas, most Japanese boards meet 14 times a year in Japanese. and discuss very, 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 it would be impossible for Jamie Dimon to be on the board of Mizuho. And until the composition of or the way the board is organized and the mission of the board is changed and the language problems are dealt with, I mean, it's a problem when you have a global company, global Japanese company, where particularly the executives, directors, information is limited to the Nikkei, and so on and so forth. I just think, for example, if there had been Gaijin on the board of Nippon Steel, I think the outcome would have been different.
One thing on that, and I do want you to prepare your questions here. I'm conscious of the time here. One thing, this laziness of the CEO, the pride into this shokunin bunka that we build the best widget. I will give you one anecdote. I was involved with Toshiba. And, Toshiba had all sorts of problems, with wonderful collusion or interference by the government as well. But we actually had a solution. We wanted to create a joint venture for Toshiba with America's leading cybersecurity company, Palantir. Right? And the idea was very simple. It's like, you're Toshiba, you've got all sorts of issues. But as an investor, what I actually want to know, and by the way, as an employee, what I want to know is, where is the road forward? What is the company going to be like in 5 years' time? Why am I the salaryman who puts blood, sweat, and tear into this company? Because it's all about scandals. There's nothing forward-looking. And, creating a joint venture of whatever form, right, with Palantir could easily have created or given Toshiba a chance to become the dominant cybersecurity company, not just in Japan, but possibly in Asia as well. And it was very interesting. Kurumatami-san, right, the CEO at the time, he basically said, well, that's all very interesting. Let me come back. And then he came back and he said, no, we're not going to do this. We're going to do this our own. So the pride, so the pride, and this is where there is so much technological change. There are so many new markets that are coming through, that the pride of doing anything in-house or everything in-house, right, rather than actually trying to incorporate and merge, right, and make 1 + 1 = 3 or 4, that's where there is a laziness amongst the CEOs, just as there is a laziness, in many of the capital structures that Japanese corporations have. Now, Andrew, I know you're itching, but you can only speak if you've got it. You're not going to talk. You don't have a poem?
Well, no, I've got
a haiku.
Chris Mellon, I'm going to Sing. Does everybody know the movie Sing?
Now he's going to
Nintendo, Chris Melandrani.
Yes.
Exactly the same situation. Nintendo made a terrible Mario Brother movies 10 years ago. They came back and they got Chris Melandrani to help them, who had done all the Sing movies. And they worked together. It was I love that phrase, artisanal appreciation. And he actually joined the board. So there is, for every bad case, there's a good case where they did come in and say they gave that pride up. They said, there are some things we're good at, which are making video games, but we're not good at making movies. So we're going to bring the best in. And that, I think, is those two, that contrast between the Toshiba story and the Nintendo story is really that's a choice. It's a choice that Japan has.
Yep. Please, Terry.
Terry Porte, and I'm co-chair. I have the privilege of being co-chair with James Kondo of Asia Society Japan. I want to thank you all for being here today. And if I can make a small advertisement for Asia Society Japan, what you see today is the best of what we do. Bringing people together, a variety of opinions that we have the opportunity to share and reflect on. And if you're interested in learning more, please see Sawako at the end of lunch. So I listened to this conversation, and it seems to me that what we're talking about is this continuum of financialization. And so Japan probably has historically had no or not enough financialization. And I think it's fair to say that in the US, we have had a number of excesses of financialization. So the question is, where do we try to end up? And I'd like to hear what you think about those prospects. But I'd also like to just share, if I may, and if you'll indulge me, a little bit of historical perspective. The difference that 2 decades makes. So in 2004, I became the CEO of Shinsei Bank. I was the first foreigner to be the CEO of a listed Japanese company, which I tell people today is not something you should try to do at home. But here's what we did in 2004. The board, I insisted, only 2 insiders, 10 outsiders. One of my best Japanese clients took me aside after we did that and said, "You trying to make us look bad? By the way, don't you realize that none of those outside directors will ever understand what the company does and can't be of any use to you?" I got 0 points for that. Mochi. We sold the entire portfolio of cross-shareholdings in one go. 90% of those companies refused to do business with us thereafter. 90%. We started a retail business from scratch. We were the first bank to offer ATMs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. No holidays for the ATMs. We started an online, first bank to do online mortgages. And we did all of this with Indian IT. In 2002, it was started through 2006. There was no cloud at that time. What did people say? My God, this bank is dangerous. They're using Indian IT. It's not reliable. Why are they not using Japanese IT? Another 0-point score that I got. Staff. I promoted more women to the position of manager or above in a 5-year period than in the entire previous history of the company. We started that retail business, as I mentioned. Half of the branch managers were women. Why? Because they were the best at it. Many of them started serving tea. An article was published in the Nikkei that I was taking jobs away from men who have to earn a living for their families. Another 0-point score. We insisted on having merit pay. Huge controversy in the company between the legacy employees and the new employees. So I finally had enough. I said, "You all get out of my office. I created a committee. You guys are going to decide what the pay policy should be in the future." They came back after 3 months and they said, "We cannot agree." I asked the legacy employees, "What do you want?" And they said, "We all want to be paid less and the same." So let's take this forward to today. Doing all of these things, I probably would get an award from the government. But in 2004, all of these things were wrong. So, as Rabia said, maybe we were in the wrong place in the crick cycle. And certainly in the early 2000s, the raw emotion of the crisis and the disaster that befell Japan was too strong. But certainly, there was a lack of any, we took that company public, the most successful IPO in 2003 since Sony in 1957, 23 times oversubscribed. And I think certainly at that time, all of the issues that we're now discussing as a normal course simply were not on the table. But what do I worry about today? What I worry about today is we've talked about incentives. And what are the incentives today? I worry that too much of the activity that's going on in the corporate sector in Japan is motivated by the threat that Yamaji-san threw down now several years ago, that if you don't improve your returns, you are going to be delisted, which is akin to telling Japanese male CEOs that their manhood is about to be taken away. So there's one incentive. Maybe there's too much emphasis on that negative incentive. I think also there is this threat of activism because, let's face it, Japan is a fantastic target-rich environment. And what I worry there is that, activist shows up, special committee is designated, often dominated by lawyers, and, what's the next decision that's made? Not necessarily the best decision for the operations of the company, the sorts of things that, George, you have talked about. So, again, it's negative incentive, as opposed to the positive incentive. So back to this, where do we want to be on the continuum of financialization? I don't think we want to be where we were in 2004. I don't think we want to be where the United States has gone. We want to be somewhere in the middle. We want to have more Hitachis and fewer Calsonics. We want to be sure that the work is done that takes account of all of the needs of the community.
Very difficult to follow such great speakers. Thank you very much. Ryan Hart, Managing Partner at Gautner Consulting, CEO at Peak 2, External Advisor. So I've long-term in Japan, probably not as long as some of you, but 18 years or so. And so I think it's a combination of what Dr. Olcott said and also what Alicia touched on. So you have these companies where people are just in the company for their entire lifetime and they're just playing musical chairs and they're not necessarily gaining new external skill sets. And they're just kind of a circular staircase up to finally becoming the CEO. And then you look at the percentage of CEOs that have an MBA here, for example, and then you expect them to be thinking out of the box that we need to come up with some financial wizardry. We need to be thinking about how we can become innovative to go into new markets overseas. I feel like there's just this lack of these skill sets and this mindset, and then you have also this huge dependence on the fact that there's vendors that are providing cybersecurity, the vendors that are providing IT replatforming, making all the decisions for the machinery of the company, and they're just kind of going along for the ride. So it's very difficult for me to see without activists, without PE firms, or these external forces to come in and say, what are you guys doing? You guys need to wake up and you guys need to get on board. I just don't understand how, as positive as you could be about Japan, that how actually are these companies going to actually move mountains and innovate at the pace that they need to survive in today's volatile world.
So where's the incentive? Anybody?
Completely agree with what you said. If you just take the example of IT and the threat of cybersecurity, because of the salaryman model, you'll find that in most Japanese companies, the head of IT, CIO, Chief Information Officer, is a man who has probably done, Japanese literature or at best economics at university, and was just dumped into the IT department, which in 1990 was basically about installing computers and has not really changed since. And it's just very difficult in an environment where you don't hire senior people from the outside with specific skills to solve certain very, very fundamental problems to create the types of corporate change which will enable the company to take in new systems and keep up with what is going on out there. Yep. That is a big problem. I think there are sufficient numbers of really excellent companies who are making the right decisions. So it's not like Japan is full of these companies that aren't facing these challenges, but there are too many that aren't.
Alicia.
I think this is a very important part. I remember talking to a Sony exec who described the problem, the crisis that Sony found itself in after the success of Walkman and stuff, is that they didn't catch the transition, analog digital, because at that time nobody was hiring from outside the company, right? Mid-career hires. It's becoming more common now, but still very small. And in my understanding when I talk to people is that the onboarding process when you bring in new hires is not sufficient. I would say also in terms of not just IT, I think for me the key deficiency, I bet everybody in this room would agree, is the CFO is also somebody who might be in charge of real estate management and HR, and he's not a strategist. right? And I suggested to many people, maybe we need to have a very baseline sort of certification, like, kind of a Series 54 or something, right? In order to be a CFO. But again, I think it's sort of mean to criticize Japan for this deficiency because, it wasn't that long ago where this was not the point, right? The point was just to make good cars, right? And I think we can all agree, internally, Japan has unbelievable, ability to engineer stuff and make great stuff. But the other strategic stuff, whether it's financial or, global M&A, that's where they need help. And I think, there are bad activists, there are good activists, there are good PE firms, there are bad PE firms, but I think this is, where we can try to be helpful. The most enlightened CEOs I meet say that they welcome conversations with activists because it's free consulting.
Can I get on your side of the bus real quickly and join you as a critic? I think we need to see ourselves as others see us. I think the place that this is, what you just described, is most problematic is actually within the financial sector itself. The people who are not speaking are the domestic institutional investors in Japan. And it's their primary role. If you go to the UK, you go to Scotland, you go to any other country, you have there wouldn't be room for us on this stage because you'd have the guys from Wellington in the U.S. or whatever it is. It is. I've asked everyone here prior to this meeting to give me your top 3 Japanese long-only investors who are kind of like Warren Buffett. No one had even one, and that is because the same thing you described. The people who are put in charge of those investment management roles don't do it, and that leaves open the story to be written by others. And back to Nitobe, and my Fukushima-san told me that this building was actually built by the disciples of Nitobe. It is on Japan to go out and do the hard work. I mean, can you imagine how hard it was in 1890 to go out and figure out how to start building things? But they did it, and that I think we share a feeling that the sense of crisis needs to be felt now and not complacency in figuring out how we get the right people who are skilled. I don't personally, not having an MBA, I don't think an MBA is the right place to do it. But I do think, and my colleague Yohei can speak to this, that there are people with those skills in Japanese companies. They're just not evenly or widely distributed.
So it's interesting, right? Finance is viewed as a utility in Japan, right? It's not something that actually creates new ventures, new businesses. It's viewed as a utility.
I'm Bruno. I work for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan. You can see, I'm a public servant of Japan, very characterized as a public servant in Japan. But I would like to, I know that Japan was discussed here, is that Japan is going to an important trade-off as cultural changes against the modernization economy. And modernization economy, the Japanese people think that they could cause disparities and poverties and things that the Western could suffer. But I would like to think about some benchmarks that Japan can use. For example, I'm not defending Carlos Ghosn from Nissan, but when he arrived and he made some changes that was very valuable for Nissan. He increased the Nissan. He break the Keiretsu. He fired people. He modernized the economy, and Nissan was booming. Of course, there are some problems there, some drawbacks, but I think that we can learn from what he did and his mistakes as well. So a benchmark about this, I think this is important. And another benchmark that I think it's important regarding this is what happened in Singapore, which Singapore was a very, very, very small island, but very poor. There has some problems in cultural problems as well. But at the same time, they could manage to become the biggest GDP per capita from the world, and they managed how to modernize the economy without losing to poverty, to many things that affect this modernization. So it's just I wanted to show that there, of course, it's a very difficult path, But I think that we can learn from history, we can learn from what has been done, and I hope that Japan could solve these problems in order to make the economy grow again.
Excellent. Fantastic. Mori-san.
Thank you for a great panel. I used to be a semiconductor guy, so I'm not a finance guy. So sorry if I ask any stupid questions, but I've been serving on a board, a public board recently, and learning about governance. So I understand, that the Japanese government is a bit schizophrenic on what he wants to do. But I hear some private equity head talking about the TSC is the best friend for private equity. Question is, you probably know that, but who is driving change, and who should we look at? And in terms of the right governance changes, because there always being a little adjustment here, there to change it. But who should we be looking at, and who is able to make those rules or make propositions to make it better, I guess.
Fantastic. Very simple question. Fire round. Who should we look at? Who will make the rules?
Who is making the rules or who should make the rules?
Who is and who should? Is consulting advice. He'll pay you nicely.
Who should be making the rules, I think, is what you yourself pointed out, Jesper, is the institutional investors. Okay? When you look for a certain person, some hero to come do this, Yamaji, I think, has done a wonderful job. But if your entire governance approach depends on a certain personality, when that personality is gone, then the governance is gone too. So I think what we need is, call it an industry association, but not just this industry. We need to get a governance committee with maybe 5 or 6 people on it, that's all, to come up with a very forward-looking thing. My model on this is what Takanaka did in 2003, I guess. He had something called the Takanaka Committee. So he's appointed finance minister or financial affairs minister, and within 1 month, he gets together 5 people who come out with a report saying we should do this, that, and the other. He put 5 exactly right people. It didn't take them too long to get it, and then he had his committee. So what I think we need is a corporate governance or an investment incentive committee that has people from parts of the financial industry, from the corporations themselves, and other people who are, call it, invested in the governance issue. But a small committee shouldn't be more than 5 or 6 people that comes up with a set of rules. This is where we think we're going to go. You put it in public and then see what happens. So I think the Ito committee was a good example, but that's what we need.
I got to push back on that because we've had so many of those committees, so many. I mean, part of it is the lack of coordination between METI and FSA, and to a certain extent the TSE. And I think the problem with the FSA, different from METI or MOF, these are guys who are making general, like classic public policy, right? But the FSA is supposed to be a regulator. They're supposed to understand the incentives of the players in the financial markets. And in the entire organization, there's nobody who's ever actually had that job. So when I come in and talk to them about, their concerns about equity swaps or interactions between activists and PE firms, they don't understand at all. And so I think one of the things that I would hope to do is to get like some sort of system where the FSA gets, sort of people actually get practical, experience working in finance, where there's secondments or whatever. METI sends people to TSE. METI people kind of get it.
Let me push back against your pushback, because the reason that the Takanaka committee worked was that there were no FSA people on it. But once it was done and decided by the political, authorities at the time, they had to implement, but that's what they do. The reason it worked is because Koizumi was behind it, and everybody knew that. And so leadership is part of it, but Koizumi didn't know anything about this. So he got somebody who did. They got a good committee, and because they knew he was behind it, then the FSA fell into line.
Yep.
So it does have to be an independent committee.
George, you have any view on that?
Not beyond what's been said, but the periods of change in Japan have been when we have politicians who are committed to change, in whether it's Koizumi or Abe. Abe was the one who drove corporate governance reform in Japan, and if he believes that this should be done, then FSA and/or METI and/or TSE will deliver.
I'm going to quote the band Rush: "If you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice." If someone doesn't make this decision, it will be made by foreign private equity firms. And that is how they've operated everywhere else. One thing that Bill Clinton, Tony Blair, David Cameron and Jeb Bush have is they all work for private equity firms, look to see Japanese politicians employed as expert advisors to KKR and other firms in the next 6 months. They will be making the policy. That's what's happened in the U.S. It's happened everywhere else, unless Japanese people get together and do what you said. It has to be a political decision, but it has to be something that is everyone understands.
So it's very interesting. I personally think that actually the degree of competition, right, with the voice, exactly as Terry pointed out, 20 years ago, this was anathema, right? Now you've got a whole bunch, the entire, I dare to use this word, ecosystem, right, is actually evolving. And it's, thank God, as a German, I'm allowed to say this, thank God there is no centralized rule maker, because nobody has the answer. What is the right answer? There are industries that need to consolidate and create national champions with a greater sense of urgency than today. There are industries that, for all intents and purposes, protect the hairdresser industry in Shibuya all day long because it adds for a nice walking experience. So what is the correct answer? Nobody knows. The good news is that the sense of urgency is here. And the sense of urgency is being amplified by something that's going to come down the pike. When Alicia alluded to this, obviously national economic security is going to become more and more important. And what Andrew, thank you, Andrew, pointed out about the inherent conflict of interest between private equity firms financing the People's Republic of China on the one hand, and on the other hand, the People's Republic of China being viewed, and in many of our businesses, not just semiconductors, where there's real hard penalties being imposed upon you for doing business with the People's Republic of China, that is obviously unequal, unequitable, and does not make any sense and is potentially very dangerous. So the question going forward, I think you will see a pushback, and you're already seeing it from the Tokyo Stock Exchange. For example, we didn't talk about financial specifics. If you do look at the takeover price, if I actually buy a Japanese company, how is that fair price determined? It is raping and pillaging the minority shareholders, right? The premia that are being paid are ridiculous. The investment banks are being hired by the buyer to do the assessment of fair price. There is no Revron rule in this country. Revron rule meaning that you as a board director are responsible for the minority shareholders. Why is Mr. and Mrs. Watanabe not investing in the Japanese share market? That's one reason, because they know that ultimately, yes, the regulator, the stock exchange, is actually not looking out for their interest. And it will be very interesting to see whether that fishing in the pond that you have for private equity firms here, because Japan is cheap. Japan has a lot of lazy balance sheets. I can go fishing and I can buy things at 10 cents on the dollar that even in Germany would cost you 95 cents on the dollar. But the Germans don't sell anyways. Anyway, very interesting. In the interest of time, I apologize for having to cut this out. We hope to have a follow-on session.